you, Ed, and to Zoe and Anna and Graham. A really fascinating conversation. And I know a lot of things that you've just talked about will be picked up in the later panel sessions, particularly the complexity of the transition to net zero. Well, sustainable investing is certainly about more than just climate risk, and 2020, you may know, marks the first year of modern slavery reporting. And our next discussion will focus on how we respond to modern slavery and human rights risks in Australian companies. We'll look at what the inaugural reporting has revealed and what more needs to be done. So your panel for this session: Vanessa Zimmerman, Chief Executive Officer and founder of Pillar 2, Mans Carlson, the Head of ESG Research at Ausbil Investment Management, Simon Nash, Practice Management Lead at the ANZ, Laura McManus, Human Rights Manager with Woolworths, and your moderator for this panel session, Anthony Chow, Deputy President of AXI and Chief Operating Officer and Deputy CEO of Lucref Super. It's over to you, Anthony.
Thank you very much, Ali, for those introductions. Like you, I'm looking forward to the panel discussion with such a talented and diverse group of speakers. We've decided that the format will be some opening remarks from every speaker. We're trying to ask each speaker to hone in on one key point to start the discussion, and then we'll try and, as best we can, moderate a series of questions and get some interactions going. And of course, we'll end with some questions from the audience. I just wanted to sort of set the scene very briefly before I throw over to our first speaker. And I think you've touched on it in your introductory comments. You know, AXI and other ESG leaders have recognised for a long time that a company's social licence to operate is central in assessing its long-term sustainability. And equally, all businesses have an internationally recognised responsibility to respect human rights through their activities and relationships. These responsibilities have clearly been set out in international standards, such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and also in the UN Sustainable Development Goal number 8, which tries to set targets for nations to eradicate erroneous workplace practices. The introduction of Australia's Modern Slavery Act in 2018 is an important recognition that as a community, we are treating these international standards seriously, and we clearly have strong reasons to do so. The War Free Initiative's Global Slavery Index estimates that there are more than 40 million people in modern slavery globally, a staggering figure. And Australia is not immune, with some estimates of up to 15,000 people working in modern slavery type conditions, whether they be trafficking, forced marriage, child labour, or deceptive recruitment practices. Modern slavery is prevalent in our nation and throughout the globe. The MSA is an opportunity for investors to reset our approach in this critical area. And I hope today's panel discussion will help you think about what role you can play in this important area. So we'll start with you, Vanessa. Welcome. And just on the theme of one key point you'd love to get across, what would it be for you?
Thanks, Anthony. And as you say, it's a really important time for the Modern Slavery Act, a really important time for looking at what Australian companies are actually doing with this piece of legislation and whether we are going to see this being very meaningful or whether we'll see it be a tick-the-box compliance exercise. And I guess one of the key points here is that investors can play such a major role in actually engaging with the companies that they are investing in to make sure that they're really asking about companies' modern slavery risks and how they are actually doing. So just quickly to give you a couple of highlights of what we're seeing in terms of how companies are reporting. Some of you will have seen today that AXI has just released a report on what the ASX 200 is doing in terms of their modern slavery reporting. And I just want to give you, I'm cheating for a second, I'm going to give you 4 very quick trends as part of my 1 point, just to highlight what some of the practice that we are seeing. So first of all, I guess we're seeing there is definitely room for improvement. There's also some room for optimism, but let me just touch very quickly on the 4 key findings that kind of show that room for improvement that's necessary. First of all, we're really seeing a bit of a race to the middle from many of the companies that we looked at. So we looked at 151 of the ASX 200 companies, and that is because as at the end of June, that's how many of the ASX 200 companies had reported under the Modern Slavery Act. The average score for the statements that we looked at was around 15 out of 41 points. That's how many indicators that we had. So a lot of these companies are kind of sitting around the middle. Only 31 of the statements actually scored above 20. So whilst we're seeing some kind of generally adequate practice, we're not seeing a whole lot of kind of best or leading practice. The other quick point is that I guess the length and level of detail in statements is really varying quite significantly across the ASX 200, and it actually can signal quality. So the average length is about 4,000 words, but the average length across all of the statements that we looked at, but the average length for the top 10 was over 9,000 words, and the average length for the bottom 10 was around 1,400 words. Now, you don't want to have a statement that is just full of words that don't mean anything, but we are seeing that those companies that are choosing to put more detail are doing better. The third point, just quickly, is that a third of the statements that we're seeing actually seem to be non-compliant with one or more of the Act's requirements around the mandatory criteria. So in particular, we're seeing issues in relation to companies actually reporting on how they're consulting with other businesses in their groups, and also the extent to which they're reporting on the effectiveness of their actions. So a bit of an issue with actual compliance with the Act. And then finally, what we're seeing is a challenge with companies talking a lot about some of the great initiatives that they're doing, but not necessarily explaining how those initiatives are working in practice. So a kind of paper over practice approach by some of them. So I think my main point is that there is room for improvement. There is optimism, though, that several years ago we probably could not have imagined 151 of the ASX 200 having a modern slavery statement and actually putting information in there about this very difficult and challenging issue. So there is room for optimism, but we do need to see investors actually engaging with these documents so that companies know that people are watching, people are listening, and they will get difficult and challenging questions on their performance. So I'll stop there. I cheated and did a little bit more than one. Thanks, Anthony.
Thanks, Vanessa. It was a little bit of a cheat, but it certainly was excellent to highlight AXI's latest research, which was released today, moving from paper to practice, and I'm sure you'll touch on some other themes shortly. Mons, I'll throw to you. For you, the issue is not just an ethical one anymore, and I know you've got some strong views around that theme. Could you share with the audience a key point you'd like to highlight?
Thanks, Anthony. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a good starting point, that the topics of human rights and modern slavery have definitely moved on beyond just being an ethical issue to investors. And if people still have doubts about that, I would point them to the share price of Boohoo, the UK-listed retailer that fell sharply last year after allegations of labour rights issues in their supply chain. And then, of course, we've got Top Glove, the glove manufacturer that was banned from exporting to the US based on forced labour allegations in Malaysia. And obviously that had a big impact on the share price too. And like I've always said for many years, this comes back to earning sustainability. So if you have a business model that relies on underpaid workers or weak regulation or even illegal activities like slavery, those current earnings are not going to be sustainable. And I think if Australia goes down the same path as the US with a Forced Labour Act, I think that's going to become much more obvious as well. And right now there is a lot of focus on the Modern Slavery Act, both by companies and investors. But I just want to flag that it is just a transparency act. And for it to be effective, I think it mustn't be treated as some kind of compliance exercise and reporting only. And as investors, sure, we can spend a lot of time doing the risk identification, but that in itself is not going to move the dial on slavery. Our actions might, though, and by actions, I would particularly highlight meaningful and constructive engagement. Not just pointing out the issues to their companies, but really try to be part of the solution, and particularly encouraging companies to adopt what we think is best practice. I think that's the best way for investors to get involved. And related to that, I think we might also collectively miss the point if we focus on slavery in isolation, right? So there's a fine line between what's technically modern slavery and was this poor labour practices. And slavery doesn't just emerge out of thin air. It often comes from years of bad practices. And particularly now that COVID has made so many people more vulnerable. And that 40 million estimates, I think that will be on the low side, because that was before COVID. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A later. But there's been some major developments, of course, around the world. And as we see the Modern Slavery Act statements being published, and to Vanessa's point, I think there's a long way to go. And so far, very few companies have actually reported any instances of modern slavery found in the supply chains. So I think there's a long way to go. Interest of time, I might just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mons, for that good overview. Laura, you've been a champion for the eradication of modern slavery for a long time. What theme would you like to emphasise today to the audience?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. And perhaps in contrast to Mon's final statement just then, that there's a long way to go. When I was thinking about this panel today and a point to land for this opening, what really struck me, and it's potentially a practitioner perspective, but I'll stick with it, is that progress has been made, though that progress might not always be visible. I think Mons just said as well that, the Act is often called, quote unquote, just a reporting requirement. But even in its current form, I think if companies can really lean into some fulsome disclosure, we can start to shift the dial. Very briefly, for Woolworths, transparency and that type of transparency is the core of our approach, whether it's working with our suppliers to increase visibility across the labour supply chain, or also holding ourselves accountable by documenting both our progress and also some of the challenges. I think what really energises me today is that everyone, in this virtual room, and it's a shame we're not all together, but we do share that same goal, which is to eliminate the risks of modern slavery. And when situations arise, we all want to do the right thing and provide access to remedy for workers. But if we're to achieve this goal, and hopefully one of the goals of this panel, I think we also need to create a space for mature dialogue about some of those inherent systemic challenges that genuinely do require a committed multi-stakeholder response. No investor, no company, no government, no civil society organisation can grapple with some of these issues alone.
Thanks, Laura. And Simon, being a manager responsible for sustainable procurement, what theme would you like to emphasise to the audience today?
Thank you, Anthony, and great to hear from the others. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're all dialing in from today. I'm on Wurundjeri land here in not so sunny Melbourne, and I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So as you say, I sit within our group procurement team, and I believe we need to be guided in our work by remembering in everything that we do, there's a potential worker who could be being exploited. Sometimes in the midst of all our activity, there can be potential. We're just managing a compliance exercise where really we're dealing with risk to people and human rights. So I think the point I'd like to make is that going forward in dealing with the issues and problems of modern slavery, there are two things that will be key. The first is that we need to embrace technology to help us in this space, whether that's blockchain technology, and secondly, collaboration, as Laura said, between organisations to be more effectful and impactful. Having said that, we're also seeing a greater and emerging focus on competition law as well, which is something we need to be cognizant of in terms of what we can collaborate on.
Thank you, Simon. I'll start with some questions for the panel, and Vanessa, because you went over time, I'm going to give you an unscripted question, but I'm sure you'll be on top of it. Look, ACSI's previous research programs have, along with this one, have recognised that poor labour practices are not just limited to international supply chains. They're also occurring amongst Australia's own vulnerable workforce, particularly in franchise operations in the horticultural sector. Did you see this being recognised in the statements that have been released?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we are seeing companies acknowledge that they could face modern slavery risks right here in Australia, in their supply chains here, as well as their supply chains overseas. So I think just generally we're seeing Australian companies have a greater awareness of what could be going on here. What we didn't see so much of, though, was companies actually saying what risks they might have within their own operations. So it's not always an issue that is just in a company's supply chain, but might be an issue, let's say, in again, where the company's own workforce, in some situations, particularly if there's a high level of use of contractors. It might be something relating to who the company is selling to. It might be something relating to, again, kind of franchisees that might not be considered to be suppliers. So I think that's an area where we are seeing a bit of a gap. We're also seeing companies as well, even if they're identifying that they could generally have risks in Australia, in their Australian supply chains, they're not really going beyond that. So they're not really doing what the Australian government has asked them to do, which is to explain how they could be involved in a modern slavery risk, both here or overseas, whether they could cause it themselves, whether they could contribute to it with a really significant contribution, let's say through irresponsible buying practices, or whether they could just be directly linked through something they're doing. That's what a lot of the companies are not doing, which is really explaining how they could be involved in modern slavery risks. And that's something that and I'll finish on this point, just to go to something that Mons and Laura were saying. When we think of this act, and it is a transparency piece of legislation, so it's really asking companies to report. But when the act is asking companies to describe their modern slavery risks, to be able to describe your modern slavery risks adequately, even though it's really just a reporting requirement, you can't really do that unless you've looked at your modern slavery risks and done it in an effective way. And so I think that is a way that we can use this piece of legislation to really encourage better action if, as Mons was saying, we actually engage with companies to kind of really scrutinise how they're describing those risks in practice.
Thanks, Vanessa. And I think that's a great link to the question I was going to ask Laura as a practitioner working at Woolworths. How have you seen the Modern Slavery Act change behaviour internally? Could you give an example of behavioural change coming from the introduction of the legislation? Some insights around that would be, I think, really useful.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. We have seen a number of behaviour changes across the spectrum. And, I come from an NGO and research background. So when I landed in corporate, I certainly landed with a healthy dose of scepticism. But we've seen changes, not just within our own business, but talking to peers across the space, that boards are now having routine discussions on the issue of modern slavery and human rights. We're seeing dedicated teams, set up to manage human rights due diligence. We've seen some really great examples of best practice remediation. But what I wanted to touch on around, this thought of where we're seeing behaviour change, some of this is occurring much closer to home, and they're what I would call, small everyday acts that are the things that are often going unreported. So, for example, over the past 18 months since the Act was introduced, we've had situations where suppliers originally in some of our sessions might not have never heard of this work or have engaged in it. And now they're proactively reaching out to us to give us updates on their program. They're sharing their modern slavery statements. We have other suppliers who are, reaching out to us seeking some guidance on remediation in their own supply chain. For our teams, I think Mons touched on that there's multiple risk lenses that, companies think about, and our teams are asking, not what is operational risk, what is legal risk, what is a reputational risk, but we are also asking, what is risk to people and what is the right thing to do? And this is kind of everyday decision making that we're doing. I have other colleagues, who might be leaving the business and have, worked with us on a working group, and they're saying, thank you so much. This has been one of the key highlights, of my time at Woolies. And even better yet, they're leaving and saying, I'm going to take this knowledge that I've learned and take it to my new role in another business. And these are some of what I would call, subtle markers of change that we're heading in the right direction, but you're not often going to see them up in lights or in a statement because it's not a quantitative data point, for example.
Thanks, Laura. And I know, Simon, we had a chat, before this session, and you talked about the motivating factor of the Modern Slavery Act in conversations you could have with some teams. And you did talk about, the lowest price pencil and trying to move beyond that. Could you share, that insight that you've used, within your organisation, and how you've used the Act and the conversations as motivators?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Oh, that's a bit of feedback. I believe there's importance in having meaningful dialogue with our suppliers and also our customers as well, and not just filling out forms. So, I do sometimes wonder what happens to the questionnaires that we fill out and send to other people. So our standard response is when we get a questionnaire incoming from a supplier or say a tenant in one of our buildings, is we actually reach out and say we'd prefer to have a conversation. Now that takes time, that takes resource, but rather than just doing a tick and flick exercise, you can have a far more nuanced conversation, and also it provides for ongoing dialogue. Yeah, the lowest cost pencil, lowest price pencil. It is a new world for procurement out there. Value and cost still vitally important, but it's incredibly important that we do our due diligence on our suppliers. If we don't know where that pencil has come from, we could be in trouble. So we've got a role to play in risk management and brand protection, and essentially our social license to operate, and education of the business and the budget holder, because procurement doesn't hold the budget, is a key part of our role. But it's also educating our own people for the purchasing decisions they make in their life outside work as well. You have the food we buy, the clothes we buy as well. And I think this is something that our procurement teams have embraced, because it makes them feel far more relevant, and it removes the perception of just being contract cutters, if you like. It provides relevance to the work, and it's something that they embrace wholeheartedly.
Thanks, Simon. Mons, you've heard the panel talk about the need for us to move beyond compliance and a tick-the-box exercise to something more meaningful. What do you think is crucial to make this step? And I know you've analysed some sectors where you think good progress has been made. Could you give us some insights about what we need to do to move beyond compliance?
Yeah, thanks. I think there's quite a few different moving parts there. Cultural change, additional regulation, the role of media, the role of investors, and I think Laura has touched on a few already, particularly the cultural journey, which I think she described very eloquently. When I started doing ESD research in Australia some 11 years ago now, there were quite a few laggards on health and safety performance in Australia, but now 11 years later, there are fewer laggards on health and safety, and I think we'll see a similar cultural journey on modern slavery too, and the Modern Slavery Act, of course, is a catalyst. But also think the more cases we'll see of sheer value destruction, as the cases I mentioned before about Boohoo and Top Glove, the more companies will take it seriously as well. And even though there is a Modern Slavery Act, which is a Transparency Act now, there could also be a Forced Labour Act, which will put more pressure on companies to understand their supply chains. So in the US at the moment, it's up to companies that import from hotspots of forced labour to actually prove that the goods they import are not made by forced labour. And in Australia, we might go down the same path as well. It's been recommended by a Senate committee, and I think that would change things. But I also think media and activists have an important role to play here. And like Laura was saying before, we need to have a space where we can have a constructive dialogue on this. And by all means, if a company is completely recalcitrant and they don't care, well, maybe they should be named and shamed. But as a starting point, I think if a company actually identifies instances of slavery in their supply chains and report that, they should be congratulated for that. And anyone who's looked at Modern Slavery Act statements to date, well, they would know that actual fines of modern slavery, that they're lacking in the reporting, right? Companies talk about risks, not actual incidents of modern slavery. And perhaps it's because it's very difficult to detect and identify, and the supply chains are very complex. And particularly in COVID, when companies can't audit their supply chains, there's a lot of risks. But I also think there's a general nervousness, right? So a company doesn't want to be named and shamed if you do find modern slavery. And then I think for many consumer-facing companies, this is nothing new, but for many companies, the risk of modern slavery is very new. I haven't looked at that before. So that comes back to collaboration, as someone mentioned before as well. Because if you have 10 companies in industry where the industry has not traditionally looked at modern slavery risk in the past, well, if they want to combat slavery, I think they'll do that better together than individually. And we've seen it in the property industry and the banking industry, for instance.
Thanks, Mons, and I hope some of the other speakers can talk about, the need for honesty in the modern slavery statements and how we get to that point where if there is an honest recognition of risk that, companies aren't condemned, and it'd be interesting to hear, other speakers' views on that. Thank you, Mons. I think we also heard from the speakers throughout the session so far the need to move beyond modern slavery into, a more broader human rights context, particularly amongst, the analysis of our supply chains. Vanessa, could I ask you, you're looking at what's happening internationally. Do you see any trends that you think might come to Australia with that broader human rights theme?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. And as you said at the very beginning, companies have a responsibility to respect all internationally recognised human rights. It's been very important to have the focus on modern slavery here in Australia because it's one of the most egregious human rights abuses that a company can be involved in. But the reality is that many Australian companies face a whole range of different human rights, the potential for involvement in a whole range of different human rights harms. And as Mons said as well, modern slavery doesn't occur in a vacuum. So it is very unlikely that you would see modern slavery without some other form of labour exploitation or other forms of human rights harm. As Mons said, in the US, we've seen some developments around still kind of a focus on forced labour, but a focus on kind of greater action by companies and not just reporting. In the European Union, we've seen a move towards mandatory human rights due diligence, and we're likely to see EU-wide legislation come in by around 2023. Some of the other countries within Europe have already passed laws basically requiring large companies to know and show that they are respecting all internationally recognised human rights, including France, Germany, Norway, Switzerland. So I think these developments are happening overseas. I think Australian companies need to be very aware of them. It might be a while before we see it happening here. I think it's probably more likely that we would see an enhanced Modern Slavery Act first, or perhaps the forced labour type legislation that Mons was talking about. But it is coming, and I think that investors overseas as well, BlackRock recently put out an announcement saying they would be looking broadly at the human rights practices of companies. And so I think companies do need to be aware of that whole range, using some of the lessons they've now learned from modern slavery risk management to apply to broader issues.
Thanks, Vanessa. Just dealing with some practical challenges that some of the speakers, confront day to day on modern slavery and human rights risks. Laura, I know Woolworths have had to deal with challenges in the agricultural supply chain of the organisation, and clearly, when we've seen some media on this issue, it's a system-wide problem faced by many other companies. How have you been working on this at Woolworths, and do you have some comments about what the industry can do to improve outcomes?
Yeah, and like many would know, our work in the horticulture industry actually commenced before the Modern Slavery Act was introduced, but it does indeed remain ongoing, Anthony, for the very reason that you've pointed out, and that's that these challenges, are system-wide and require, an ongoing and collective effort to address. I guess first, very quickly, what Woolworths has been doing about those issues is our approach, in agriculture and horticulture in particular, is not dissimilar to our work in other sectors, and we follow the same program style approach. So to, your earlier question as well about human rights due diligence, it's very much a human rights due diligence approach, which is about, setting the minimum standards through our responsible sourcing policy and our standards. We have recognised the additional risk in horticulture around the management systems of labour providers. So we do have additional requirements for labour providers in our horticulture supply chain. Once we've got our policy set in, we take a risk-based approach to defining which sectors or categories are inherently higher risk. And we've identified 7 categories in the horticulture space, and they tend to be areas where there's more manual labour requirements and also a much shorter seasonality. So then we've got our risk assessment, and we conduct further due diligence then in those higher risk areas, taking a number of different approaches, and that includes multi-stakeholder pre-harvest briefings. Of course, COVID has, forced some of those to go virtually, but it's also enabled us then to bring a different group of stakeholders to the table. So we've run sessions with suppliers, the Fair Work Ombudsman, the state-based labour hire authorities, unions and other retailers, and we've all been able to get together to talk about some of the challenges that we might face pre a harvest season. We then conduct grower and labour hire information checks. We prioritise audit for those higher risk categories. We conduct worker engagement through our partnerships with the unions. And again, pre-COVID, we were conducting site visits during peak season. I think on that point of COVID, and like Mons has pointed out, for horticulture and in fact some of our other sectors, it has meant that we maybe haven't been able to move as fast as we had hoped, but we've certainly pivoted to find other ways of increasing our visibility and also remediating issues when they arise. This area is a challenge. It will continue to be a priority for us because we want to be leaders in promoting consistent experiences for workers across the industry, and we'll keep engaging industry to that extent.
Thank you, Laura. And Simon, some of the challenges you face involve, visibility across supply chains and some of the difficulties. I know you've got some insights there about how you've overcome that challenge and different ideas that people might be interested in hearing about.
Yeah, I think visibility across the supply chain beyond the tier one supplier is a huge challenge for many companies. And this is where technology will play a huge part. We did an exercise last year looking at promotional items, and we make each year a money box in line with the lunar calendar. And before we got to the factory that manufactured that, there are 3 suppliers who are engaged in that before you get to the factory, and then beyond that there's all the raw materials, whether it's glue, resin, paper, paint, etc. So understanding that across your entire supply chain is hugely difficult, and that's where blockchain and other technologies come in. A great example of that is here in Australia, New Zealand and Fiji with the World Wildlife Fund's bait to plate exercise, where consumers can see via a QR code where the tuna steak that they're cooking, which boat it was caught on, and follow it through the supply chain.
Wow.
And verify it wasn't engaged, that boat wasn't engaged in human rights abuses. So we're at ANZ, we're currently looking to implement a module with one of our existing suppliers who helps us in this space, to provide access to over 1 billion shipping records to help us understand our extended supply chain. Because believe companies, I've identified a risk. You can identify your tier one suppliers, but it's getting beyond that where the real challenge and where technology will provide the opportunity.
Thank you, Simon. We've had a flurry of questions, which is really pleasing. We've clearly sparked a lot of interest amongst the audience. So I might go to a few of the questions. We've got one from Keith Harvey, and he's given a series of questions, and I might just pick out 1 or 2 for you, Mons, to try and respond to, and feel free if others want to add to the answer. Mons, what data or research is available re workers subject to modern slavery in Australia, and what sectors are most at risk? And that's come from Keith Harvey.
Right, sorry. Yeah, look, when it comes to risk identification, there's a lot of information out there, I think. You can start off by just having a look at things like the Global Slavery Index. I think that sort of points you in the right direction in terms of where the hotspots are. But coming back to the point about having a wider human rights lens, I think you need to think quite widely about the risk when you do your risk identification. So most modern slavery happens in the cash economy. So of course, there's a strong link between modern slavery on the one hand, and then anti-corruption and money laundering on the other. And there's a lot of human rights indices out there that you can look at as well. But I think the whole purpose of the risk identification should really be to prioritize your engagement as an investor. And I really want to stress that point, because that can help you to then set your engagement objectives. And for that reason, there's a lot of information out there as well. One thing I would flag would be the investor toolkit done by the RIA Human Rights Working Group a couple of years ago. That sets out a number of useful tips for investors in terms of how to find modern slavery risk in a company. What are the traits? So if we go beyond just the usual suspects of the Global Slavery Index, etc., you can also look at the industry dynamics, right? So if you have a supply chain where there's a lot of migrant workers, if there's a supply chain where there's only a few buyers who put a lot of downward pressure on their suppliers, who then cut corners and cause subcontracting. A lot of information about that is available in that resource, and also how to engage effectively, and particularly what to engage on. I mean, we are of a view that investors can play a big role in terms of combating modern slavery, but we need to do that in the right way. To have consultative engagement where you actually look at cases where there's win-win solutions, both for companies and workers, with a business case. So that toolkit is full of that. A lot of examples of how you can engage effectively. Hotspots, well, I think the starting point is that everyone has some risk, right? In Australia, we know that it's mainly about car washes, nail salons, the horticultural supply chain. But then globally, you have gloves manufacturing, particularly in Malaysia. You have the whole issue of forced labor issues, allegations in China, in the Xinjiang region, apparel, mining. There's quite a long list, actually. But so I don't want to single in on a particular one. But Southeast Asia is where most of the forced labor rights issues are.
I've got a number of questions. I'm just trying to summarise them as best I can, particularly pointing to the use of Uyghurs in the Zhejiang province in China's global cotton supply chain and the clear human rights breaches there. You know, the broad question from a number of audience members is, what can investors do on this issue? And I might ask maybe you, Vanessa, to comment, and please, Simon and Laura, if you'd like to add, please do so.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. It's a really difficult and challenging issue, and I think it's you know, for many companies, this is obviously it's very sensitive, it's very difficult, and in some cases, you know, those companies themselves obviously might be struggling with what they should be doing. I think for investors, the key point is to engage, as Mon said, and to actually ask companies, do they think they have a risk relating to that region? If they do think they have a risk, do they know where the risk is? Is it with their customers? Is it with their suppliers? Is it with other types of business partners? And what are they actually doing to make sure that they can better understand what's going on? With COVID, and even if there was no COVID, it would be very difficult to go on the ground and check. But there are steps that companies are taking collectively and individually to try and get a better sense of the risks that might be going on there. I think also being very mindful that companies, particularly those that might have their own workers in that country or in the region, need to probably be very mindful of some of the consequences that might occur if, you know, for looking into these. So to make sure that any steps that the investor is asking about are, you know, kind of taking into account some of those challenges, but just asking the question, because the more to the business case discussion that we had before, the power of a question coming from an investor. I've been within a major company and seen the power that those questions can have to actually empower somebody inside the company to say, people are asking us about this, we have to be able to have an answer. So I think just asking the question, but doing so in a careful and sensitive way.
Thanks, Vanessa. Ali, I'll try and give the participants some time back, but we've got one final question, and we'll try and make it a 20 or 30-second response from each panellist. And it's come from Chris Newton. He's given us a left field question, which we expect from Chris, but thank you. The panel has highlighted some negative impacts on companies. Have you seen any upside beyond compliance and risk mitigation for companies? If so, you know, what have the upsides been when they've engaged around modern slavery? So maybe we'll ask each panellist to give a positive concluding remark before we throw back to you, Ali. So Mons, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, one example that comes to mind is an electronics retailer we spoke to earlier this year, and we asked that question about, you know, the positive impact. And what they noticed was the increased focus on modern slavery internally, as in their supply chain, has actually lifted staff morale. So there's actually a link between the work they've done and the staff engagement. And staff engagement, of course, then you can link to better customer satisfaction too. So there's definitely cases where it's lifted to or resulted in a positive outcome. And then you've got some businesses out there who actually focus on responsible sourcing as part of their value proposition.
Thank you. Thanks, Mons. I'll throw to Simon. You're positive.
I think that the positive is the discussion around it, and I mentioned it before about around training for our procurement managers, or everyone has to go through that. But I say, if you take it away for what you do in the company, also take it away for your own personal lives as well. So educating people around the decisions we make in everyday life and what we buy as well. So it goes beyond just compliance.
Laura, your thought?
Yeah, I think Mons stole my thought before I had the chance to get it out. But I think it's definitely around this work being really closely linked, certainly from a Woolworths perspective, to our purpose and our core values. And you can see that really connect with our team internally when we talk about it. But the second thing I'll say, is about to really solve some of these ESG issues, of which, modern slavery is often, referred to as the big S in that framework, is that we need to invest in skills and have diversity of thought at the table when we're making types of decisions in this space.
Thanks, Laura. And Vanessa, final comment.
All of the above. I think also seeing boards, non-executive directors really engage with this, and being then to open up other parts of the S of ESG has been really good. And the other thing that Mons referred to earlier at the beginning was just industry collaboration. We actually have seen, as Mons said, the property sector, infrastructure, mining, fashion, come together to talk about these issues, which is only a good thing.
Thank you very much, everybody, for a very informative discussion. And it's always difficult to do it digitally, but I hope the audience felt that we were successful with this presentation today. And Ali, before I throw over to you, I'd encourage every member of the audience to look at the research paper that actually is released today, Moving from Paper to Practice, the ASX 200 reporting under Australia's Modern Slavery Act. So little plug before we throw over to you. Thank you.
Anthony, thank you. And thank you, Vanessa and Mons and Simon and Laura. A really fascinating conversation, but also really practical. And I guess that's what it's all about now. It's not about what's on paper. It's about what everyone will do in practice. So it's now only for me to throw to morning tea. So I hope you've got some really delicious sustenance in your own kitchen, or some decent coffee, which you will have if you're in Melbourne for sure. And go off, refresh, and we will be back at 11:30 for our directors panel. Right now, though, we will break for morning tea.